Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. I am Jordan David, and if you are new here, trust me, we're both surprised. Today we are going to be taking a look at Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, more specifically, everything that I underlined when I read the book. When I go through and I read a physical copy of a book, I just make quick underlines, and sometimes I write little notes about passages that I thought were particularly insightful, or at least controversial, or really striked me as poignant while I was reading it. And one of my favorite pastimes is to go back to these books after I've read them, look through the underlined portions out of context, and see if they still are insightful. A lot of times they aren't. So I'm going to go through here, and I'm going to read off the things that I underlined, and then I'm going to discuss why I think I underlined it and why or not it might be poignant. All right, let's get started. Page 19. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. If the dispositions of the parties are ever so well known to each other, or ever so similar beforehand, it does not advance their felicity in the least. They always continue to grow sufficiently unlike afterwards to have their share of vexation, and it is better to know as little as possible of your defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life. Okay, that's a controversial one right off the bat. So if you couldn't translate that through the Old English, it's probably because you didn't have the previous 19 pages to kind of prime you. But basically, what Jane Austen is saying is it doesn't really make sense to base your potential happiness with a partner on whether or not you have things in common with them. Because from the moment that you get together, you're going to be growing in two different directions anyway. This is what people do. Even if they're at the same point, at the same moment in time, eventually they're going to be different people. And so it's silly, in Jane Austen's mind, to pair on somebody based off of similar interests. And she argues that, in fact, the joy is in discovery of somebody different. So if you want to partner up, she's more of a proponent of just randomly prearranged marriages where you have a chance to get to know your partner and grow into loving them despite the differences, versus finding somebody that seems like a perfect match first only to discover that you're vexed by them. So that's an interesting concept, because a lot of our conversation around love today is all about finding perfect character matches. Do they like going to the gym? Do they like listening to the same music as I do? I think that these similarities help early on in relationships in determining whether or not you have this immediate chemistry, because you have things to talk about to kind of test the waters, see if you can both hold a conversation with each other, and see if you care about what the other one has to say. But I've pointed out to my parents before, I don't think that they have very similar interests, and yet they seem to have a very happy marriage. They've been together for, I think, 28 years, and there's never been a point where they've really considered separating. So I would say, on the whole, it's a successful relationship. But my dad's a really sporty guy. My mom's a really nerdy girl. She watches Murder, She Wrote. He watches Lord of the Rings. They don't have, like, a binding link of the same taste in music or a same type of TV show. What they have is a very deep emotional understanding of each other that they chose to foster despite not having those interests. Now, they didn't have a prearranged marriage. They still had to find out if they had that chemistry. And I think that Jane Austen would argue you do need that chemistry still, because she has her character in the book reject a marital offer from a man. But anyway, she thinks that prearranged marriage is an option that certainly exists in non-Western cultures, and with some success. I think they have a lower divorce rate, but that could also be due to societal pressures, not because of the presence of love. Whew, that was a long first one. Let's see if I can make the second one quicker. Page 34. And I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit, but I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever look into. I thought this was just a witty remark. It takes place in a conversation between our protagonist, Elizabeth Bennet, and her sister's love interest, Mr. Bingley, who is a very rich man by being in a rich lineage, whatever, large inheritance. He buys this estate, and she's sitting in his library and talking about how he has all the books. And he goes, "Oh yes, I don't have that many books, but I have more than I'm ever going to read." Which, I don't know. It was a clever remark. See, some of these things, they don't have to be life-changing for them to strike me in the moment as, wow, that's beautiful writing. Good job. Page 41. Of a fine, stout, healthy love it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already, but if it be only a slight, thin sort of inclination, I am convinced that a good one sonnet will starve it entirely away. Okay, so this comes from a conversation where they're talking about whether poetry helps love or kills it, and Elizabeth, our protagonist, is of the mind that poetry does not nourish love, versus this Mr. Darcy, who ends up being Elizabeth's love interest, considers it poetry the food of love. And her argument is, hey, you can say lovey-dovey shit to somebody who you already love, but if you start going way too hard in the paint for somebody who only has a slight inclination for you, you're going to scare them away. Which I thought was just another cute, witty remark, and very true. Page 45. Nothing is more deceitful, said Darcy, than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion, and sometimes an indirect boast. Now, this is something that Emily Bronte also talks about in Wuthering Heights, the point that I keep highlighting in all my videos, that I thought was a beautiful point, which is the humble and generous are only more justly selfish than the domineering. So I'm not saying that you should be a selfish person. I don't think that's what Emily Bronte is saying either. But the point is, there is some inclination towards the self and thinking that you're a great person. And there's two ways to process that. You feel guilty about how much you love yourself, and so you act humble to gain the attention of others through your selflessness. And then you feel good about yourself for having that attention for being selfless. Or you can go around saying, I am great, look at me, agree with me that I am great. And it's interesting, I guess, that Jane Austen views it the same way, in saying that maybe being humble is worse than being openly selfish, because you're kind of being a little deceitful when you pretend that you're selfless to get the attention of others. Same page. Nay, cried Bingley, this is too much, to remember at night all the foolish things that were said in the morning. I think that everybody can relate to this. You have a strong opinion on a subject, or you feel like the world is going to end, and then the day passes and everything turns out fine, and someone goes, see, I told you so, and you go, I don't want to hear about that. You try and change the subject, and I thought that was a witty way to put it. Nay, we shouldn't be brought up at night all of the foolish things that were said in the morning. Her character works really great, by the way. The way that she connects with every human being on a character basis, assigning the traits, the things that I feel, and the things that I see in other people, it makes this a very engrossing story. Okay, we got a long jump here from where I was, page 142. Importance may sometimes be purchased too dearly. I think that's pretty straightforward what that means. I think a lot of times people go out into the world and will do anything to be of value to society, again, for their own personal gain, and sometimes that means sacrificing their own morals or their own interests in the end. Page 146, what are men to rocks and mountains? I feel this so hard. So I think that out of context, this isn't as funny as it is in context, but basically Elizabeth is getting out of town with Jane because the man who she was really crushing on didn't propose to her, which she thought was going to happen, and then he ended up leaving town, and she's disconsolate. What's the word for that? Inconsolable. Yeah, inconsolable. Disconsolate? What is that? Is that when you lose your status as a consulate? She's inconsolable. And Elizabeth makes this witty remark, what are men to rocks and mountains? And it reminded me one time, my buddy Tony and I, we were taking a road trip, and we kept going to see all of these different rock formations in Arizona. And at first, you see the Grand Canyon, and you see Horseshoe Bend, and you're like, oh, wow, this is amazing. And by the time that we had made it through Monument Valley and we're on our way to Vegas, Tony goes, it's just all a bunch of rocks. And I'm like, yeah, these are the things that we use to distract ourselves from real life, rocks and mountains. What are men to rocks and mountains? It's silly to think about. We have all these real matters that are very close to our heart, and we fill our time doing things to distract us from them and try to find the same joy in them and fulfillment in them that we get in other people. but it just never really comes close, right? 224. A scheme of which every part promises delight can never be successful, and the general disappointment is warded off by the defense of some little peculiar vexation. This was when Elizabeth was taking another trip by herself without Jane, and she's saying, this is going to be really good for me, but I can't pretend that it's going to be perfect. My only regret in going on this trip is that I won't get to bring Jane with me. But that's good, because if you set your expectations that something's going to be perfect, inevitably you will be let down. But if you say, oh, well, this would be better if, you might be surprised at how much fun you have despite lacking something that you wish you had. So it's more just a general statement of, don't set your expectations too high. It's better to expect nothing and be surprised than to expect a lot and be disappointed, but written in Old English. Still insightful, so I underlined it. 323. We all love to instruct, though we can teach only what is not worth knowing. That hit me with some different shit when I was on the train. I was like, oh, you are so right, Jane Austen. Because I have often felt that, for example, my mom gave me great advice about how things were going to feel when I went off to college and how to overcome, certain feelings that I might have, how to deal with my first heartbreak. All the information that she gave me was honest and it was true, but I felt like it was useless to me, even though I knew what she was saying came from her own experience, because I hadn't experienced it yet. And then when it was on my back to learn the lessons of life and the understanding of the world, the things that she said to me came into clear context, but only after I learned them for myself. And that's the kind of the human conundrum. We all get to gain these vast experiences, and if we had a way to communicate them properly to each other, we would all know a lot more about each other and a lot more about ourselves. But our words fail us so much, and we all love to teach those insights that we've learned, but oftentimes we're only able to successfully teach the things that aren't worth knowing. Beautiful, beautiful passage. I feel that every day. Every time I have an insight of my own, I'm like, damn, a million people have had this insight before me, but I had to learn it from myself for it to make any sense. Darcy was not of a disposition in which happiness overflows in mirth. That was page 352. I underlined that one just because I felt that really hard too. There's a time in my life where I was generally demure and depressed, just because, I don't know, chemicals in my body situationally where I was at, and I felt very isolated, and I would go out and try and meet people, and even when I was having a good time, I looked very uncomfortable. When I was happy, it didn't overflow into mirth. Now, I'm lucky now because I seem to have gotten some of that back. When I'm having a good time, I appear like I'm having a good time. I'm feeling it. I'm very gregarious, only because of the work that I've put into making that a possibility. But it can be really hard because the whole point of this book, Pride and Prejudice, is that Elizabeth Bennet, the protagonist, has this prejudice against Mr. Darcy, who appears to her very prideful. And he is prideful, but he also is a man with feelings and love and happiness within him. And if only they could get on the same wavelength of communication, if he was less prideful, if she was less prejudiced, then they could be in love, right? Okay, so that's the whole point of the book. And all of the miscommunication comes from his inability to express how he feels. And he comes off as a very pretentious man, even though he's a very sweet and kind man by all accounts of people who really know him. And I think that it's not unique to me. I think a lot of people feel this way, that they're unable to communicate what they feel inside on the outside through their facial expressions, through their energy level. And it's good to know that Jane Austen took note of that way back when, and it's just as applicable now. And this is why this book is great, because it has a character for everybody. And Mr. Darcy is that guy who's kind of like stuck in his shell, very isolated, and can't really express his feelings in a way that he wants, and maybe comes off as pretentious when he's in fact a very generous and kind man. And then 360. How unlucky that you should have a reasonable answer to give, and that I should be so reasonable as to admit it. I thought that was just a clever line in Old English, saying it's ridiculous. Like they're arguing about, why didn't you do this earlier? Why didn't you admit how you felt about me earlier? And it's funny when you are diffusing a miscommunication and you're telling another person how you feel and you go, but you did this, and then they have a perfectly logical explanation for an action that seemed to you, based off of your prejudice, as maybe rude or standoffish, when in fact they were just as nervous and uncomfortable in the situation as you were. It's kind of a cute thing when you realize that, damn, they have a good answer for every reason of, why they did what they did. And unfortunately, I'm a rational enough person that I have to admit that maybe the way that they acted, given the situation, was reasonable. I'd really prefer to be angry at you, but everything you're saying makes sense, and I'm being forced to admit that. And I'm so mad that I'd rather be angry at you instead of angry at myself for misunderstanding. And that's it. I didn't highlight anything else. I don't know if this was of general value to you, but maybe if you've read Pride and Prejudice and those lines also stuck out to you, you found some joy in it. Let me know if you like this kind of series where I don't have to go into an in-depth explanation of the plot and the characters and the author, because I feel like this is a little bit more fast-paced and a little bit more agreeable to a more general audience. And if you didn't like it, give me that feedback too in the comments. And subscribe if you want more book-related content, Zillow content, personal-related content. And until next time, cheers.